All right. Well, I am very excited to be here today and to have this opportunity to speak with four very distinguished Black leaders. I am a facilitator, and if you can't see me, because if this is transmitted by audio, I am a white leader. And so I don't know about the other leaders on the call. I myself, I have to tell you, I'm feeling a little bit nervous that I'm going to publicly display my white privilege in some way. So I still feel that the conversation is so important that I'm going to put myself out there, be vulnerable. And if my Black colleagues need to, in some way, sort of reframe my questions or help me to understand that either I'm in my privilege or I'm speaking in a way that isn't comfortable, that they are going to have the kind of gravitas and empathy to be able to interact with me and let me know that. So that's the premise by which I'm starting this. The reason for this discussion, just to set the tone, is I've been doing this work, diversity and inclusion, for over 2.5 decades. I have very successfully been able to navigate with our enterprise clients to move women towards gender parity in some very compelling initiatives. I have never, in the 2.5 decades that I've been a professional, ever been asked to address any issue related to how people of color feel in the workplace, related to any sort of disparity in terms of equity. So we're about to have a discussion about that, because the timing is right, because large companies as well as the society as a whole is actually interested and finds this issue compelling. So we are going to galvanize on that momentum, and we're going to set into motion difficult conversations. We're going to try to give people in the workplace some tools to have these difficult conversations in a respectful way and in a way that leads to something impactful potentially. So we have a really lofty objective here, and I'm very hopeful that we can meet it. Let me set the frame before I ask you each to introduce yourself. Let me set the frame for our audience. I chose the people on this call extremely carefully. I was looking for Black professionals because I think this is really a Black issue. We can have further issues about Black and brown people, people of color generally, but right now I think that we're framing it as a Black issue based on what has happened in the recent past sociologically. And I chose these people for a few reasons. First of all, I wanted to carefully establish gender balance, which I think we have done. I wanted some generational and or age balance, which I think we have done. I wanted people that express themselves, articulately, but also with empathy. People who could express this issue in a way that was actionable as opposed to divisive. People who were willing to be vulnerable and really transparent about what they're experiencing as human beings, as well as what they're seeing in the workplace. So let me tell you, I chose very, very carefully. And I chose some individuals who not only, some of whom are currently working in large organizations, large, corporate America, and some who have worked in corporate America in the past who are now advising corporate America. So there's a wide variety of experience. So having given that frame, I am now going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves. I'll call upon you so that you can unmute and give your introduction. And I'm hoping when you do so that you will tell people a little bit sort of about your past and present, in the sense that all of you in some capacity are involved with the mission of diversity and inclusion to some extent. Not only are you living it personally as human beings, but you're actually working it as a function and as a competency. And so if you could tell us also how you got into it, and anything else that you might want to use to frame your introduction. Keep in mind, let's not get too into the issues at first, because I first want everybody to meet you and then we'll start really getting into the meat of the discussion. Let's go to Anthony Harrington.
And hi, Denise, and it's a pleasure to join you today. I'll tell my story. My professional career started at PepsiCo in a number of sales leadership roles. And when I was there, I was lucky. I worked for high-performing diverse leaders and high-performing diverse teams. And it was back then when I really learned the value of working on a diverse team. Late in my Pepsi career, I volunteered to join a diversity committee. That was my first exposure to diversity and inclusion concepts, and where I first really started feeling a passion for that work. I left Pepsi after 15 years, and I worked at Nike, but in a supply chain leadership role. And when I joined Nike, I still had that passion for diversity and inclusion, and so I did stretch assignments and volunteer roles, leading different, helping the diversity and inclusion team on a number of initiatives, and led the Black Employee Resource Group at Nike, where I worked with amazing ERG leaders. I worked with enterprise leaders and the diversity and inclusion team, outside of my day job. But even then, I got closer to this work. I really started thinking about how employees at the center of D&I solutions could make a difference. And those volunteer experiences inspired me to shift my career to D&I. And I took on a global director role with the diversity and inclusion team, leading a number of important initiatives, leading all the employee resource groups. And my journey in D&I continues today. I've had this shift where I want to do work where I could intersect my strengths and my passions. And so I left Nike after 15 years, and I started my own D&I consultancy and professional coaching business, the Harrington Group. This work is important to me. This mantra, together we thrive. I'm really lucky to do this work now with companies interested in really making change.
That's wonderful. Valencia, would you unmute and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Denise. My name is Valencia Colbreth, and my journey started by being challenged by my children. I didn't start in the field in corporations working within D&I or DEI now, but it was more volunteer with equity and supporting the school districts and looking at our Black and brown population and interrupting predictability in their achievement, their gaps, and how they show up. It was that passion that continued to drive my want and my need to do better, not only for the children and our future leaders, but what can be done within our corporations in those spaces today. And I had some really amazing and challenging conversations with my company, and the leaders and the buy-in was absolutely incredible. To take the next steps to do this work, and seeing the value that it had as a company. And so it's been my calling, and that's what I've always said. And now I get to push and lead the company in this space.
Very exciting. And Valencia, for those of our audience that is listening but doesn't have video and I really don't know what the decision will be with regard to video versus audio, but I just want everyone to know she is a young woman in the sense that, young comparatively, Valencia, since we'll call me old and we'll call you young. But the fact of the matter is that you have achieved a lot within a very short period of time and been able to be a leader in your organization, and an example to other employees and leaders, Black and white, and do that in a way that negotiates the normal politics of corporate life. So congratulations, and I'm glad to see you as a leader for diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization. And I hope to be there for you as a colleague every step of the way. So thank you for joining us. It's an honor. April, I wonder if you would introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm April Allen, and some people say it sounds like a superhero, but I assure you I am not a superhero. I am just a lady who has a passion for DE&I. Right now, I am currently head of diversity, equity, inclusion at Daimler Trucks North America, which is a large trucking company, the largest in North America, actually, with its headquarters being in Germany under Daimler AG, a Mercedes family. I'm honored to occupy that space and to do this work in that space. My journey started years ago as I advised a nonprofit and worked with a nonprofit on programming and community development programs to reach people of color. From there, I've done work on the compliance side, the EOC side, investigations, even whistleblowing, but I just have a passion for it. I'm also a children's book author. I've written 2 books in the space on diversity and inclusion for children, as well as allyship and self-esteem. And so I'm just honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, April. Eugene, let's hear from you. Can you give yourself an introduction?
Yes, Denise, thank you so much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here to spend this time. I want to just chat briefly about my background. I got into the D&I space back in the late 80s, so I'm dating myself when I say that. I was working with AT&T at that time, and at that particular time, they essentially were in a huge transition as an organization. They lost the monopoly as it relates to the business, and they started to migrate people to Mexico and encourage people to move to various portions of the country that were out of Chicago. And at that particular time, I migrated over 30,000 people across a variety of different states and out of the US to do that work. And what I realized at that time, they would essentially have the proper education or kept up with their education in order to be mobile and to move forward. And then I began to think, how many people are impacted that way who really don't follow through on their careers and their focus? So that's where my interest really started. Migrated to, I'm a former human resource executive from Motorola, where I worked for about 20 years. I studied culture throughout that. And no matter how often I digress and focus primarily on delivering human resource services to over 28,000 people in over 32 different countries, what I realized at that time was that African Americans and Black Americans' voice was not being heard within the Motorola platform. And during that time, even though my role was not in D&I, I was always the person that they went out into the region to basically say, well, Eugene, you know this work and you've done this work in other places. Can you help us? So I was always in the organizational development space to do this and to help with that. And it was very helpful in that sense. And so I've worked in academia. I've also worked in research organization, researching, looking at team science and focus on how people get along, operate, and their day-to-day business. And that for me continued to resound itself in terms of giving people an opportunity to develop a voice, acknowledge their voice, and to permeate that voice across the platforms in which they are engaged in. And so for that, for me, that's an ongoing challenge and an opportunity. And I would say D&I is my life, because we'll hear more about that.
I have found that I carry trauma. And these events actually reminded me of 2015, when the murders of Philando Castile, Michael Brown, I was in the workplace then. And I remember having similar trauma. and not really feeling like I was in a culture where people really was equipped to talk about it. So imagine coming to work every day, you have the coffee, water cooler, and just real quiet. And I remember that being a moment where it's like, personally, I had angst, anger, but from what was happening externally, but I also felt a gap in having colleagues to talk to about it, black or white, right? And I always thought about that. It's like, where is the empathy? Because we all are seeing the same thing. So interesting enough, you know, news cycles happen and you get on the other side of that. And this time it is different. And the trauma is back. And because I've noticed that it wasn't just George Floyd, it was, and Breonna Taylor. But I see Black bodies dehumanized. And I definitely identify, and at any given moment, I have found that I'm having a tough time. I will also say at any given moment, I see conversations happening at a different level. I see people actually getting out of those feeling comfortable, having uncomfortable conversations. I see more of that. And so I have this balance of dealing with my own trauma and having this glimmer of hope that this is this seminal moment where there's real change. The big realization, though, is this trauma that I carry, I understand now that I've always had it. And I just didn't actually realize it. When I think about it now, I think about it not just this experience, and I think this is what causes me trauma. I think about the history of racism in the country. And I think about the George Floyds and the Breonna Taylors that actually didn't get caught on video. And so in my mind, I can actually, and it gets overwhelming to talk about it and emotional, but I think about all the bodies that you actually didn't see. And I don't think about just the ones that died. I think about the ones that are impacted in the criminal justice system negatively, that are getting a poor education negatively. And you start adding up like the bodies. I'm doing that more now than I've ever done in the past. And so I think that's what's different. And I think that's what contributes to some of that trauma that I talked about, is just the awareness of the implications. It's a combination, because I have a community of people that we heal together. But there's also this self-care that I have found to be really important. There's a mental wellness component of that, because all of that trauma, if you just think about it, how it could impact your day to day. I'm not working in a corporate America anymore, but oh my gosh, right? If you could just imagine the implications of that, having to carry that with you every day. So it's a combination, Denise. One is there's a commitment I have to myself and my family on my own self-care and mental wellness. But, I never miss the opportunity to, have community with others, and not always just Black people. I have white colleagues, especially even some clients that I have right now, that have the empathy, right? The empathy to actually not have to identify with being Black, to understand that this isn't right. So that awareness I'm finding, this is where I have some hope. This awareness I am finding there's some solidarity across race, gender, across humanity, in pockets, for sure. That's what I see.
I have never felt this level of exhaustion. And that's an understatement. I like to say when I was pregnant, I was exhausted. Like, this is a mental, physical, emotional exhaustion. So just to walk you through the week of this, when the civil unrest, as they would say, began, I was sent out my email and said, you know what, this is coming down the turnpike and you have to prepare. Where's the statement? What are our steps? I began to facilitate that. I began to communicate, lend all the support I knew how to lend to my CEO and all of the C-suite. And but what was so challenging was for me is that I still was, while doing my job, I still was experiencing the trauma, as Anthony so eloquently stated. I was like, this is my professional and my personal life. It is too intertwined at this moment. And this is a nightmare I can't get out of. And one thing I kept saying to my white colleagues was, you can push the X on the right of the computer screen, the laptop, your iPad, and you're done, because now you need a mental health break. I am living this hell as a Black woman, as married to a Black man with Black children. And so, just to be honest, this is not the most professional moments of my life, but I had to give a presentation, and I thought about canceling. And there was this women's executive leadership. They had me scheduled and was waiting for me to come. And I was wrestling with, would I cancel? And what ended up happening is I cried the first 5 minutes. And I said, excuse me, but this is a very human emotion to a very human issue. And I can no longer separate my professional and my personal life at this moment. And I begin to tell them about the conversations I had to have with my child back 2 days prior, about what, as my 7-year-old, what being Black in America meant in an age appropriate fashion. And I said, I can't communicate. This is my best self, I told them, but please bear with me. And they expressed empathy. And I heard people crying. There was a Zoom call with about, 100 women. I heard people crying and sniffling, and somebody said, thank you for saying that. And I saw different Black women who are in executive positions turn the camera off so they could cry or say, thank you. Someone married to a Black man said, I'm crying too, and I'm scared for my husband's life. So it was able to give them a safe space. But it's just hard. I can't even convey what I feel. I'm not one short of words, and I'm short of words these days. So. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a good question. That was the challenge. And as somebody who has not, I hate to say prided, but thought I was pretty competent in the space. I work in education as well with educators and consulting them on diversity and inclusion. And I'm a children's book author on these issues. This is one that I had to be very careful and delicately talk to my child about. I took her to the waterfront. And my husband and I looked at each other and said, it's time to have the talk. And we began to tell her what some of the fires she saw on TV was about, because unfortunately she's out of school because of COVID. So she was seeing things that she normally wouldn't see, like I turn the TV off or try to push the X. But I said, okay, this is what's happening. She even said, what is that word racism? Because she had heard someone say it, who was talking about, we're going to end racism, and it was a white man. And I said, this is what it means. And she had learned about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but I told her, I said, it's simply when people don't like you because of the color of your skin. And there are still people that don't like people, brown skin. They don't like, I said brown because, she said she gets Black and brown now, but you're like, they don't like brown skin, they don't like Black skin because of what they look like. And they're not always nice, and they're not always fair. And we expanded off of that and let her ask questions. We said not all people are like that. there are some really, really good people, and I pointed to people that are in my life that look different than us, and said, you know, that's mommy's friend, and that's your friend, and they love you. I said, but there are people that are bad people, and this is what's happening. And when you have, and when people feel that you're not listening to them, when you're saying somebody's hurting me, someone's not being nice to me, you get people start speaking out for injustice, and that's what you're seeing, in what a voice of injustice is happening. And so I explained it as best I could, and she's grappled with it. She's still grappling with it. She's going, okay, so are these people nice? Are these people bad? And what I never wanted to do was prejudice her against any group of people. I've been very careful about the words I've used since she was, when she was processing language, I would tell people, don't say that about a group of people. I was, very upfront about that in my household. But this was the time I had to say, you know, this is very much still what's happening. And it just wasn't Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks you learned about, or, the bombings in Birmingham of the little girls. And I had to tell her. And so she's still processing, and it's an ongoing conversation we're having, and we're reading books that are age appropriate on civil rights leaders and what does justice look like. But it's a hard time. It's hard.
Yeah, of course. The feelings after these few months have been compounded overwhelmingly sad. Like, I've just been overwhelmed and sad. And it started with Ahmaud Arbery and those discussions in our household. And then it just seemed to layer after Breonna. And then George Floyd was such a huge breaking point for us, for my family, for my husband, and I would say even for my kids. And the reason I say George Floyd was our tipping point was because we were raised to know what we could expect and what we could predict around the justice system, around officers or encounters there, or if we're going to be followed out of store, or if we're not going to get great service, right? So we've been conditioned to understand how to navigate life as a Black family. And for us, I feel like we have been suppressing the emotions that have come out from that. And then after George Floyd, I wasn't able to function. I 100% fell apart. I could no longer give a reason to my kids about why this is happening. My son came to us while we were getting ready for bed one night, and he said, I don't want to go outside and play anymore. Black people are dying. I'm afraid. And that breaks our hearts, right? How do you support your kids in understanding what's happening, and then balance and support an obvious outrage, and also support compassion, as to not have prejudiced kids around any group of people or any job description, right? So for us, it's been an extremely hard balancing act. And for us to have to show up as their strength, right? So then there's a balancing act for my husband and myself to just support each other from an emotional standpoint. And then how are we showing up in our jobs every day, expecting to be emotionally capable to perform? So for us, it's been a huge roller coaster of emotions. It's been hard, and it's been trying.
Valencia, I want to ask you, and first of all, again, I don't want to overuse the word heart wrenching, but this is hard stuff to hear. Notwithstanding that, I'm going to ask you, how do you, raise these children in a way where they're going to walk out into the world, and in addition to, not being afraid or maybe having to be afraid, not be angry? Because as you know, anger as an emotion has all sorts of ramifications, right? Anger, if it galvanizes you to action because you have the power to act, is one thing, but a child doesn't have that capacity. And they don't have, they don't have control, they're not independent beings yet. And individuals who walk the earth with anger, it gets in their way. I mean, it'll get in their way in an interview. It'll get in their way in terms of how their colleagues perceive them. How do you deal with that? What would you say to the person who's walking around feeling angry all the time? How do they dissipate that or navigate the waters in order to be successful? For example, I'm going from kids to corporate America, but it has ramifications, right? From the time they're young all the way through their lives, as they're trying to become professional human beings. What do you do with that?
Sure. So for us and our kids, right, like, I've been angry 100%. Absolutely. I've been at a place of anger, but my kids have not seen that. And we were intentional about being role models around this, which carries another layer of emotion to try and hold that together, to ensure that they see sadness, yes, absolutely, but not anger, because that's not what we want to teach. And like I said, it's about supporting compassion and love for all people. It was said earlier regarding empathy, right? And that's something we have to model. And we want empathy from others, and I have to teach empathy and show empathy for my kids.
All right, I thank you so much for sharing that. Eugene, what about you? Pretty much same question in terms of what you're experiencing as a human being, as well as any sort of advice you want to offer to others who might be dealing with some of the emotions that have already been expressed, as well as whatever you're going to share with us.
First of all, I just want to extend my thoughts and concerns and support to the panelists who've already spoken. I feel your anger. I feel your emotions. I feel your fear and reflective thoughts, because what the whole process did for me, I give some quick background. Born and raised in Montgomery, Alabama, okay? At the helm of civil rights, everything that could feasibly be done to a person has been done to me. And so when this came about, it really surfaced some childhood things that I experienced and had to weather through. It even pushed me to begin to reflect on what most people call the Black experience. And I'm now calling that the Black expense, because everything is done societal-wise to our expense. It's how we persevere, how we operate through that, and move it forward. And I heard Anthony talk earlier about various people who have lost their lives under undue circumstances. And there was a young lady out of Chicago that came to Texas and actually died in a sale here in Texas. I had the privilege that young lady and her 3 other sisters and her mother was a part of my church. I watched them grow up. And to hear that in the media and to understand it, I remember her when she was a little girl. And growing up, really, this whole situation put me back in that mode where, and you can probably detect it in my voice, I feel a little emotional right now because it touches me in a strong way. I remember growing up in an environment where if you were anywhere out on the streets and Black, you were automatically in trouble. You didn't have to do anything. And so I watched friends die. I watched them die at the hands of policemen. I watched them die at the hands of sometimes each other, and watched them go through a lot. And I remembered a circumstance. My oldest daughter is a pharmacist. She is 35. And in that, she works here in Texas in a establishment, a hospital. And I remember at age 7, it was just she and we were coming back from her cousin's house. And I had said to her I was going to take her to a movie. And I got the days mixed up on when the movie was playing, but stopped. And that's when you had kind of curbside where you could go look at a movie and you could get the tickets out front. And I went to check on the tickets and I came back to the car and she said, "Are we going to the movies?" And I said, "No, we're not." And before I could say anything about why, she said, "Dad, can we not go to the movies because we're Black?" And I said, "That's not the reason." I said, "The reason why that's the issue, I mixed up the date." And I said, "Remember that for anything, you can be anything you want, anything you desire, and your skin color is only the exterior, but is more about who you are." And to this day, she occasionally brings that up to me. And so that made me kind of realize that. And the other quick thing that I would say is that we look at the violence that's happening right now throughout the US, and it's been happening for a very, very long time. And so if you remove the violence and look at internal to businesses, I personally can say that I've been violated, I've been treated indifferently my entire life, my entire career. I've always had to work 3 times as hard to achieve average recognition. And there were always people waiting to accept what you're doing and to take it as their own, to even steal it and take credit for it. And so those are all the things that if you remove the violence, we're still being violated at our expense. And so I would say to the audience that's listening, let me start on the Black side first. And the distinction is that when you are African American, meaning born in the US, and if you are identifying as Black, but may be from another portion or region of the world, it's important to differentiate those, because you never want to call someone Black when you don't know how they identify. And so for those Blacks that are out here, I would tell you, if you need a model to displace your anger, channel it. You need a model to take the emotions and the trauma and to put it into a perspective where it has positive implication. You got to go within and you got to pull from where you're at currently. That's making some assessment of your personal life, your professional life, and ask yourself the question, are you truly being your authentic you? because if you are, then that means that you should be able to put past some of the things that you are currently experiencing, but be an advocate and be in an action mode to help people to get past what they're experiencing as well. And let's go from being Black or African American to white Americans. I want to say to you that it's important that in order for us to fix this issue that we have, I've heard the terminology used as we look at equity. I firmly believe in the diversity space and inclusion, that equity automatically speaks to the fact that you don't have it, you're in a striving mode to achieve it and to try to establish it. And for African Americans, we have never felt equity. And no matter how it comes up, because if you bump into 1,000 people, a large portion of those, you'll see some people who have success and feel like they have it, and then others will be still in transition. The other key thing, I want to use a different terminology, which is parity. Parity takes on a different focus in the sense that if you are truly trying to assist people and not have color, race, creed, sex orientation to be a preliminary component where you disenfranchise or include, remove that and look at how would you in your personal life and professional life like to be treated. And then go to the most rudimentary aspect that you can think of is humanism, because we're all human and we're all creatures who are thriving on this earth, who deserve to have a quality of life and live in an environment of safety. And Maslow hierarchy of needs is for all of us, not a chosen few.
And I think that is that's a great way to sum it up, and I really appreciate that. The next part of this that I want to get into is how do we galvanize on this momentum to have open conversations about this that will lead to a positive outcome, that will lead to, synergy and help and collaboration between white and Black employees, or, or just human beings in the workplace. And even, and I'll add an extra layer onto that, which is, I'm hoping someone is going to comment about how to create psychological safety for these issues, because I'm sure that you as Black professionals have dealt with feeling psychologically unsafe your whole life. I will tell you, as a white professional and someone who does this work for a living and has done it for over 2 decades, I still often feel uncomfortable about what I'm supposed to say or not say. And I'll just give you one example of that, and then I'd like to be quiet and have you guys take over. The one example is that in a particular setting, I asked questions of my Black colleagues, and the reaction to that was, Denise, I am not your repository. I'm not your Encyclopedia Britannica or, Google search bar, for, what is Black, do your own research and education, etc. And I thought about that and I thought, okay, that's reasonable. But on the other hand, I felt utterly humiliated and embarrassed, that I had created such a faux pas or demonstrated such ignorance. So, and that's for a person, I have to say, who's educated, who's aware. Imagine the people who don't necessarily have the tools, the skills, the education. They're wanting to talk about this, but they don't know how. So that's a big mouthful. So I'll synthesize that by saying, do you have any advice for how we can show up as your white colleagues to have these conversations? or just even broader, what do you think just broadly about creating psychological safety, no matter what vantage point you're coming at, so that we can have valuable conversations that might lead to a positive outcome within our workplaces. And you can just kind of, raise your hand if you feel like you have something to say, and I can call on you. I think that's probably the best way to handle it right now. So Eugene, since you just spoke, I'll switch to Anthony, and then I can always go back to you. Go ahead, Anthony. And you'll have to unmute. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. One, it's important to, well, I tell people that one thing is it's important to approach the topic of race with respect. It is a heavy topic, so it's like respect for its weightiness. There's decades and centuries of pain and oppression. Respect for the different perspectives and narratives. There's those that have been lifted up by racism, those that have been pushed to the background. So one of the things is just acknowledging that it is a tough conversation, and treat it with respect. We've touched on this. One of the things that I tell people is we can assume racism and sexism is everywhere. And it's not just what people do. It's also what's been done. And it's how we all live in it. And when that's the beauty of the education, is it doesn't take much education to get that. And that perspective allows us to be curious, everybody, and notice policies. It's just pure awareness, policies, patterns, who speaks, who doesn't, who isn't present when racial or even sexist talk occurs. Right? The education piece is important. And, I tell colleagues this, people that have bachelor's, master's, PhDs, treat racism like you treat that. There's books, documentaries, articles. The reason why the educate yourself is so powerful is you've heard the emotion out of the four of us today. We can't expect your colleagues of color to always be the one to lead the charge, because there's a lot of energy. You shared, Denise, the horror that you saw and the empathy that you have for this situation. When people educate themselves, they're able to actually lead the charge as well. So to me, there is power in the education. I wanted to give you context to why it matters.
No, I think that is amazing, and thank you for that. Even from the point of view of my own education, I can see that much clearer. And I think the way you expressed it too was so powerful, because it didn't create defensiveness in me. I mean, you could have said, Denise, do you have a do you have a Google search bar? Whatever. You didn't. You were trying to explain to me how exhausting it is to feel like you've got to be a champion of your own life, basically, or represent an entire group of people as if it's your responsibility to educate me. And you're absolutely, I mean, what was I thinking, really, now that you've said that? I mean, I could put in Black Lives Matter. I could put in anything just about. I could put in the history of Black oppression right now, and I'd probably get a complete timeline of everything that has happened, from the advent of slavery. So thank you for saying it in the way that you did. And I think that was actually a very good interaction, Anthony, from the point of view of me being vulnerable enough to tell you how I messed up, more or less, and you being able to tell me why or how it was perceived. And feeling like we're colleagues, and you're basically trying to help me get out of my own way.
Yeah, because perfection is the enemy of progress, right? And we could try to be perfect to try to not say the wrong thing and miss the opportunity to have this dialogue we're having right now. And so I think your approach is perfect. You're asking the right questions, and that's what we should be doing. Like, one thing we all learned from the Me Too movement is women can't solve for sexism by themselves.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep.
And it's the same thing here. Black people make up, what, 13% of the US population? We're not going to solve for this by ourselves. We need white people in the mix, being active, helping create and drive change.
Yep. And thank you, by the way. I mean, and I think that it's worth saying that, you know, I mean, maybe it could just be something like, you know, I acknowledge your interest, Denise. And here's what I would do if I were you, because frankly, this issue is exhausting. I mean, if I had to say to you, the one word that I have heard from clients post George Floyd, and it's mostly from my Black colleagues, but not entirely, it is the word exhaustion. And I think I've said that to April, and I've said that to Valencia, and I've heard it from you two in particular. Exhausting to deal with your own emotions, to deal with the emotions of your family, especially if you have kids that you're trying to, you know, help navigate the waters, and exhausting to try to help your leaders to understand this issue without creating divisiveness. And I'm speculating that you also have to look like, oh, I don't have a chip on my shoulder, or I don't know. This is what I picture mentally. I picture on top of everything else that you have to come off like, not that it's not a big deal, but that somehow make them feel, as particularly if they're white leaders, that it's okay, you're not at fault. Or this is what I imagine in my brain. Does somebody want to comment on my little imagining rant? April, why don't you unmute yourself?
No, I think that's a good little brain picture right there. I mean, there's this balance. There is this balance, this tightrope walk that Black professionals, especially in the DEI space, have to walk, because you want to tell the truth, and you want people to eat your food, but it has to be palatable. Right. And I was saying, if it's on a dirty plate, if I go to a nice restaurant and you give me a dirty fork or a dirty plate, I don't care how good your T-bone is. I'm already turned off. And so I'm like, I don't want no food. No thanks. Let's go to a different restaurant. Let's go see. So it's this balance. And I think after George Floyd, I know personally, I was working so hard to contain emotion, yet be effective in my communications, yet not be, I hate to even say this, the angry Black woman stereotype that I have to combat anyways, anytime I show any kind of emotion other than little sunshine, you know, like I'm smiling, you know, I always say I have a big smile for a reason. I'm sure I got this huge smile for a reason, because I say some really tough things, and it's not always going to be tasting like candy when it comes down, but, you know, usually I could put a smile behind it. And this was a time I couldn't put a smile behind it. But one thing I wanted to say, when you said, how do you create those spaces? And even though you said, look, my Black friends were like, figure it out. Right? Because I always say, as a D&I professional, there's something I call it grace space. I call it, you have to have a grace space. And it's because you're Black or Latino or whatever, everyone's not called to the work in the sense of, I want to be a spokesperson for my community, not because I don't care, because I'm apathetic. It's because there is a grace space that has to be there, where you say, you know what? I was in North Carolina doing this work, and I told them, look, this is your chance to ask me what you think are stupid questions. And I said, there's no stupid questions. What is stupid? And I'm a professor, and I teach cultural studies, and I teach ethnic studies and constitutional law. And I'm always say, there's no stupid questions. What's stupid is when you don't ask the question. So I'm always like, just ask the question and start digging why. Why? Never stop asking why. Why? And if you ask whys, through Google, I'm going to say, not through me when I'm emotionally raw, you will figure out a lot of things on your own, or at least have some context of why certain things are so painful. But one thing I challenged my leaders with, people in senior management, was you have to create a safe space. I had people calling me crying in the cars, crying in the bathroom. I don't want to go to work. And I kept saying, why are you going to work? And I said, why don't you call in and say, I can't come in today? And they were like, or I can't be on the Zoom call. And they had that burden of being Black. I call it. They felt I have to perform because it's going to dock me on my performance review if I show emotions and that I'm a human being. And so one thing I was saying to management that was reaching out to me, I said, look, have you created the safe space? What's that look like? That's making sure that your management team doesn't focus on the riots, because that's what some people were dealing with. Like, people are talking about, I'm uncomfortable, I can't get to the store, or I couldn't get, my plans were canceled because of rioting. I said, no, you make sure that the conversation goes to, how do we even get to these riots in the first place? And who was rioting? That's a whole nother conversation. But don't let them, have a safe space for that pain.
April, let me ask you a question. How did you, or did you, I should say, did you communicate to senior management that inaction is impossible, or and if so, how, and how did you explain, how did you explain the why of that?
I told that how I explained it. Yes, Denise, I was very frank. This was the time I didn't care how you perceived me at this point. I knew I was there to do a job. I told them that silence is guilt. I said there's crimes of omission and there's crimes of commission. And if you decide to, by any means, think we cannot say anything, act any kind of way, you are guilty. And thank God for my company. My CEO reached out to me immediately and was like, when I saw what was happening, I began to say, we have to draw up a statement. And I will say he was very gracious and thanked me for all the help and support. And we talked a lot that week, just kind of making sure, what are we going to do? Push. And he even said, you're hard. He said, you're a little hard on me.
Yeah, but he also had the courage to reach out to the right person.
Yes.
Let's give him some credit, right? He didn't put his head in the sand. He said, I have April Allen, and he communicated with you, got your perspective, and most importantly, followed it.
Yeah. And that's what was important. He listened to me, even in my own emotions, I was able to talk to him and say, look, this is what I recommend strongly you need to do. There's no time for silence. I sent that out to all of the board, to a certain group of people, I should say, and they got the memo and they got the message. And but I was very frank. I don't think there's a time to retreat or to be weak or to there's times where you have to speak, and this was the time.
Well, and as you mentioned, on top of that, having to put your own personal feelings aside and advise as to what's the best interest of the company. So some good things have come out of this, April, because I'm not saying you wouldn't have gotten the ear of the CEO of your company, but you sure did now, and he got to see you as a strategic advisor, which is a great thing. Valencia, I'm not going to speak for your organization, but you've been an informal D&I leader since I've known you, which is over a year, and now you got this. To me, it's a promotion. You got this position. Possibly, I'm not saying entirely, but timing wise, because the time is now, right? I don't know. I don't know if you want to comment on that or not, but I just think I'm trying to hone in on the positive momentum, and and what I see, Valencia, who's been an informal D&I leader, she's now a formal D&I leader. I see April, who's always been a strategic leader, who is now being seen as a strategic leader at the highest levels of the organization. I see Eugene and Anthony having a voice with their clients and having meaningful conversations that they haven't had to this extent before. So what do? We have 10 minutes left. Let's make a contribution to corporate America and help them to understand how to take this momentum out of a tragedy or multiple tragedies, however you want to see it, and use this learning for good to push our society and our companies forward in a way where every one of us can reach our full potential and feel psychologically safe and contribute and invest in our companies because we feel protected and that we belong.
Before I give more details that will be tangible, that can be utilized for those who are listening, I want to go back to my two female panelists who just spoke. And I want to leverage the dynamics and the intensified nature of your messages that you gave earlier. And what I would say to the people who are listening, if you're a leader in an organization, I want to recount some of the dynamics that occurred with the video of George Floyd. And in the moment before he perished, he called out for his mother. And I would like for you to think about, what if that was you and your mother was worried about you and something that tragic happened to you? That puts you in a perspective, no, not the line of the family and where you come from, but the principles are still the same. The origin of a child, no matter how aged, what their age are at that time, what nationality they are, they came from a mother. And that is the quality and depth of life. And if you're looking at it at that very concrete way, I would say, what if it was you? What if someone was worried about you? That puts us more into the individual realm to begin to think about what's your role in this process. And I want to put you in two categories. Some of you are leaders out there, you're not aware of your behavior. You're not aware of the precedent that you've already set. And as I work with leaders throughout the country, one of the key things that I'm always working with them on is improve your self-awareness. Know who you are, know what the impact of who you are on others. And if you don't know the answers to that, there's a prescriptive measure that you can begin to explore. Think about who you are personally, who you are professionally, and don't think about the fact that work is different than home, because they're one and the same. You don't leave yourself at home. You take that to work with you. Your belief system, your thoughts, your ideas are permeating your thoughts through your day and through situations.
Yeah, and come out by accident, even if you don't intend them to be.
Yes,
Yeah.
and remember that when you are in the midst of whatever you're communicating and doing, you're being watched. And if you were in great times before COVID, before racial unrest occurred around the country, that means that people weren't necessarily looking at you, but those who didn't completely agree with decisions you've made, things you've done, may not have felt that they had a voice that they could speak out. So be aware of the fact of where you're at and where you must go in order to make a difference.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, because I'm just conscious that we have only a few minutes left, so I'm going to go around the horn. Valencia, what can corporate America do on any level to galvanize on this momentum, on the fact that this issue is now front and center, and for the first time is a conversation that people are having in the open? How can they use that momentum for good in the workplace?
Mm-hmm. So we talk about George Floyd being different. And when you think about all the bodies that we've seen and some that we haven't seen, George Floyd is no different. George Floyd is Breonna, is Ahmaud, is Trayvon, is everyone. It is the outrage now that has become the tipping point for everyone. And there has been a light shone on this issue so bright that if you are a leader in the company, you have to make a choice. You have to choose. There is no middle ground. It is not political. It is a basic human right to live. So I say to leadership, when you look back, and as someone who's modeling behavior and hopefully leaving a legacy, what do you want people to say about you in this time?
So what I'm hearing, both by what Eugene said, Valencia, as well as what you said, that one of the most significant things that can happen is senior leaders of organizations coming outright and saying that what happened was an outrage, and demonstrating in some way their empathy for the violence and extinguishing of a life, you know, that we all saw, along with the emotions that everyone who can, you know, more closely relate to this human being could be feeling right now. Is there anything else, that, you know, and if you need time to think about it, all of you, that's absolutely fine. But is there anything else that can be done other than, you know, actively voicing the outrage as well as the empathy towards employees that are suffering?
Well, it goes beyond just acknowledging it, because that's easy.
Right.
Right? If you've got employees of all races hurting because of what's going on. And at this point, when I say there's no middle ground, you've got to make a choice. You've got to choose, and you've got to act. Because the minute you come out and let people know where you stand, you've got to have some action behind that. You've got to start showing some receipts that it's not just lip service, and that you actually do care about your marginalized, your oppressed employees. What systems and structures have you put in place that has kept either people of color or the Black community down? You've got to start looking internally and making some changes.
You know, one thing that you just said, just like a light bulb just went off for me, is that the optics of this are, you know, in terms of where you put your resources, right? So just saying, you know, A, I acknowledge, B, it's wrong, you know, C, I have empathy. Those are very significant factors. But the whole world is looking at where you're putting your resources. So if you're saying that, but you're marginalizing everything from, you know, your diversity and inclusion, internal staff in terms of how much staff you have, or in terms of their salaries, if you're marginalizing their resources in terms of their ability to engage with other professionals to bring solid training, you know, to the table, if you're not giving the organization the timeshare and the mind share for these discussions, or you know, really good training about not just unconscious bias, but what inclusive behaviors are, what they look like, et cetera, you know, in an actionable way, then you can talk till the cows come home, and everybody's going to see, you know, what those optics are. Likewise, if you're not looking at diversity, and by that I mean race, gender, every you know, every kind of diversity, in terms of the optics at the top, I would argue that you're fooling yourself, because if you're a Black professional coming into an organization and you see only white faces, the message that you're getting is, okay, I can go so far and I can go no further. So there are, you know, I'm not using the term optics lightly, like a check the box thing. I'm looking at it as, just know that all of corporate America and globally, we all know what real support looks like, and it's where you're putting your time and where you're putting your money. So to just, you know, to stop at words is never going to be enough, but it sure is a good start. So let's continue to go around, and then unfortunately we'll have to stop. And to the panelists, can you go a few minutes over? Just a couple of minutes, just so, because I haven't heard from April or Anthony. April, anything, any active thing that corporate America can do to galvanize on this momentum? Actual action steps, not aspirations, but actual action.
Yeah, actual action steps. One thing you did say, and I'll just quickly mention that, and you said optics optics, we're looking at your optics because they do tell a story. They tell a story. And so if you see that everyone at the C-suite level or in senior management or even management is for this context white, a white person, you start wondering, can I get there and what happened? So one thing that I always encourage institutions to do, or leaders or heads of HR, is I'm always asking them, are you actually looking at your exit reports? Things like that. Are you looking at why people exited your job, and who's exiting, and what levels are they exiting? And that's told me a lot of stories when I go into companies. Why are people leaving, and who's leaving, and what are those numbers look like? But I would say, this is the time to leverage your EBRGs or your ERGs. If you have employee resource groups or networks, this is when you go to them and say, hey, what are we doing? And really do a gut check survey and inventory, one where you have to have some tough skin and let them tell you the truth. Also ask them, what would they like to see? I know at my company right now, we're talking about how do we get more people through the pipeline in leadership positions, and what are you going to commit to? What are you going to commit to? Also, how do we have mentorship programs, even reverse mentorship programs, where you have Black employees mentoring some of white leadership, saying, you got to get with the program, and these are some of the lenses. Basically, you need a different lens. You don't have a lens you don't have. So these are some things you can do. I really think is, leveraging your EBRGs and seeing the action items that they would like to see taking place as they're on the grounds.
Okay, I really appreciate that, and I think corporate America will too, because they want to know. Okay, I get it. What do I do? So, Anthony, you're gonna wrap us up. So you get to. Let's see, you get to answer that question about action and also kind of leave us with some sort of a central message of some kind.
Wow. Well, I really, I can only build on what's been said, right? Because it's like we all have tapes, is what I would say. I remember 3 years ago, some of these conversations happened, and there was amazing messaging that came out from organizations talking about their commitment to diversity, specifically Black people advancing in the workplace. And now we're 3 years later and we're still having the conversations. And so really being sharp and making change in representation on boards, leadership teams. I love what April said. And that's something that I've taken from corporate and really feel like I could build on in my practice. And how are we using D&I analytics? One thing about companies is they already do this. They measure what matters: sales, revenue, cost. We're measuring at a channel, at a geography level, to drive business performance and to drive shareholder value. There's always this resistance to actually look at our representation data at that detail. And for me, what I would call on diversity and inclusion practitioners is, how are we measuring our progress? And how are we leveraging that information to hold the organization and leaders accountable? And many times, these are organizations that might want to be held accountable. Let's put some mechanisms in place to actually do that. And by the way, we're leveraging a methodology that those organizations have anyway. And then we have solutions that are embedded across business, talent, and culture in a real systemic way. And we're measuring our results. That's something that I haven't seen. And I would love it in this seminal moment if that's an outcome that organizations take advantage of.
I think that's a very profound way to end this. And what I'm hearing, and I'm just going to sort of expand upon this just a little bit in order to say goodbye to our users, is let's deal with this situation as a challenge or an opportunity, however you want to look at it, but strategically in the way we would address any other strategic business problem through, as Anthony mentioned, specific measurable outcomes, through, as Eugene and Valencia mentioned, by our leaders actually taking a stand, through April talking about the optics, but meaningful optics of showing people that they can actually move through the talent pipeline to senior leadership positions. And let's not make this window dressing. Let's make this real and actionable and measurable, and address it as we would any other strategic KPI. And I'm using those business terms in a very calculated manner to make a difference. Because if not, they're just words, they're just aspirations, and there'll be one more life that expired, for naught. There's all this discussion about whether he's a martyr, whether he was a good person or a bad person. Who cares? His life mattered like everybody else's. And if we can turn a tragedy into something that actually moves us forward, beyond, the Civil Rights Act and all the hope and expectations that we had for that really being meaningful, and make it meaningful, then I can feel good about that. And I think I probably speak for the panel because I know that everybody on this panel wants to see something good come from tragedy. So let me end by just saying I cannot thank you enough. I always thank our guests on webinars and podcasts, and I always mean it. But in this particular case, you guys gave of yourselves in a way that I have not seen in my 25-year career. And I cannot tell you the gratitude that I'm experiencing right now. And I hope that you get that gratitude from every single person who listens to this interview and benefits from you as a panel. So thank you again. And I hope to be talking to you very, very soon and very often.